Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Today we'll continue with our first section, first and second language acquisition. And if you remember, last time we talked about the stages that children go through in order to acquire the language. So this time we'll talk about how the children acquire the language, how do children go through these stages, which is the theoretical views of first language acquisition. We have different views. But before we start, I made a quick quiz, so I make sure that everyone understands what we talked about last time. So we have 4 simple questions. If you know the answers, or try writing your answers in the comment section. So first of all, what are the ways that infants communicate through before they can speak? We talked about a stage that children go through, or ways that children use before they learn to pronounce words or consonants, to be specific. At what age children comprehend their first words? Let's focus on comprehend. What is the other name for the one-word stage? We talked about a name for the one-word stage. And what does the name telegraphic stage indicate? We talked about the word telegraphic and it means something. So let's start with our lecture. Theoretical views of first language acquisition. We have 4 main views, which are empiricism, behavioristic view, innatism, nativist view, and we'll talk about universal grammar, interactionist approach, emergentism, connectionist viewpoint. So let's start with empiricism, behavioristic view. The most known or best known proponent in this view is B.F. Skinner. He was an extreme empiricist, so he stuck to that view very much. Also, his view will be a bit different from other views because Skinner was a psychologist. So we'll see the language acquisition process from a psychologist viewpoint. So, behaviorists had many views about first language acquisition. First of all, the child is a passive recipient. So they consider that the child is only subjected to language in the environment and influences around him. So, like, he doesn't have any role in the language process. He's just a passive recipient. And also gave a huge role for imitation. So the child received the language and imitate it. So he produced through imitation. Also, they considered language as a verbal behavior. What does that mean? That means that only what is observable and measurable is accepted. So it's verbal, it's concrete, it has nothing with anything mental. So mental events were not accepted, only what they can observe and measure is accepted in their view. They explain vocabulary comprehension through classical conditioning and explain vocabulary production through apparent conditioning. So we will talk about them. Classical and apparent conditioning, as we said, explains comprehension and production. Comprehension, like the child forms an association between a stimulus and a response. We mean by that imagine that every time the mother hands her child his milk bottle, she says the word milk. So she says, for example, here's your milk, drink your milk, or something like that. So the child forms an association between the stimulus, which is the milk bottle, and the response, which is the word milk. Then the child tries to produce that word, which is the production here in apparent conditioning. So if the child uses the word 2 times or 3 times after that, relies on 2 different things, which are producing the desired effect and reinforcement. What do we mean by that? So the child uses the word milk. Let's imagine 2 different scenarios. In the first scenario, the child uses the word to refer to milk, so he uses the word correctly. So he says milk, and so he receives his milk bottle. In that case, the word is produced the desired effect. In the second case, let's imagine that the child used the word milk to refer to something else, for example, bananas. So he said milk, but he wants bananas, but what he actually received is milk. So in that case, the word didn't produce the desired effect. So that may get the child to not use the word anymore. Also, there is reinforcement. So in the first case, he will be reinforced positively, maybe from his parents or caregivers, by saying good job, that's your mark, or something like that. So he'll be reinforced positively. In the second case, he will be corrected. So like, no, that's not milk, that's bananas or something like that. So he will be reinforced negatively. So in that case, he won't use the word eventually. So, but this view had many criticisms. First of all, there's little evidence of direct reinforcement of children's utterances. So, not every time parents correct their children, or maybe parents are not always there to correct their children. So, direct reinforcement is not always there. Also, imitation accounts for little syntactic learning and infrequent beyond the age of two. So, if the child only imitates, how do we know all these syntactic rules? How do we apply rules to sentences and also words like the plural s and the ed for past tense? So imitation doesn't account for these things. Also, it's infrequent beyond the age of two. So how do we acquire the language after we are beyond the age of two? Also, children produce forms like good or wanted. Like just as I said, it doesn't explain syntactic learning like these forms, although they are not correct. But children produce these forms, so behaviorists didn't explain how do we produce these forms. Also, it fails to explain creativity. So children produce novel meanings like soaky instead of wet or soaking wet. So these novel utterances is not or are not explained by imitation or behaviorist approach. So we have our second approach, which is innatism or nativist view, which is like the exact opposite of the first one. It relies on biology viewpoint, and it didn't give much role for the environment. So the most famous nativist is Noam Chomsky. Actually, he's the one who criticized behaviorists the most. So nativists consider that children are equipped or pre-wired to acquire language. So it's something in their biological uh, it's something biological in their brain. It's not something they acquire from the environment. Also, they argued that innate structures are the only reasonable explanation for the rapidity of development and universality of stages. Actually, the sentence rapidity of development and universality of stages, it's what we talked about in our previous lecture. Like the stages that children go through are all the same, and they almost reach the same stages at almost the same time. So the linguists said that the only reasonable explanation for these things is innate structures. So they come with a term which is universal grammar. What do I mean by that? First of all, this view suggests that a human possesses what can be considered as a mental organ in their brain, and they called it a language acquisition device. So they say that in our brain there is a mental organ, so it's not an actual organ, it's a mental thing, which is called language acquisition device, and inside it we have the universal grammar or shared rules or principles. Like the most famous or obvious example for universal grammar, which is the word order in a sentence. So like SVO, like subject, verb, object, or this structure, we have it in our universal grammar in the language acquisition device. So let's imagine that this box is the language acquisition device. Inside it, we have universal grammar. As we said, it's a mental thing, not an actual thing. In other words, UG is the innate principles and properties that characterize the grammars of all human languages. So, linguists came with something that is logical problem of language acquisition. It's something like we talked about before in this video, which is language learning would be impossible without UG because the input data are insufficiently rich to allow acquisition to occur. So we are not subjected to much language, or sometimes children don't communicate a lot with their peers or parents, but they somehow manage to acquire the language properly. So they say that UG is the only reasonable explanation for that. Without UG, it's impossible to acquire the language. Also, the inadequacy of the input is also referred to as the poverty of the stimulus. So the language that children are exposed to is somehow or sometimes inadequate. So it's not proper. Like sometimes adults use abbreviated terms, repetition, question. They uh, um, differ like in the stress and intonation from the adult language, but somehow children manage to acquire the language properly. So which is poverty of the stimulus. So they say that UG is the only explanation that children manage to acquire the language. So this view had supporting evidence. First of all, younger children are able to perceive a multitude of sounds differences even if they didn't occur in their native language. So, children of different backgrounds and different cultures and countries perceive a multitude of sound differences. So, even if these sounds don't occur in our native language, in childhood we are able to perceive the difference, like the difference between P and B. Even if it didn't occur in our native language, we were subjected to these differences and we were able to differentiate between them when we were children. But this ability, if not enhanced, it will be lost after the age from 10 to 12 months of age, which is known as auditory discrimination ability. Then we have the developmental similarities in stages, and those stages are attained at similar times. We talked about it, which is uh, the universality of stages and the rapidity, which is the same for all children. Also, children acquired grammatical units in a similar order. By grammatical units, I mean like morphemes, the ing morpheme, the ed, also prepositions like in and on. So children acquire these morphemes at similar order and almost the same time. So this is also supporting that language is acquired by innate ability. Also, there's the famous WOC test that reveals that children generalize rules or sometimes overgeneralize rules. So, what is the WOC test? So, a scientist came with this thing and told the children that this is a WOC and said, if this is a WOC and we have two of them, so there will be two WOCs. So, we and the children generalize the rules even if it is, if we didn't hear the word before. So WOG is not a known word, and even though we managed to apply the rule on this word, and the children do the same. So this is what we mean by generalizing rules. But this view had one main criticism, which is it gave too little attention to the environment. So it considered the environment to serve only as a trigger. So we may consider it as a criticism because the role of the environment will should be much bigger than that. So after the first two approaches, we have the interactionist approach. While the first two, one of them focused on environment and the second focused on the innate abilities. This approach gave credits to both, actually. So interactionists point out that a crucial aspect of language environment is the speech adaptations in which children are exposed to. So I talked about the speech adaptation, like abbreviations, repetition, paraphrases, these adaptations, and they gave it a name which is child's directed speech. So the child directed speech is linguistic and paralinguistic adaptations that child are exposed to. What do we mean by paralinguistic or prosodic? So, which is something that above language itself, it's like tone of voice, gestures, and something like that. We have another term for this child-directed speech or CDS, which is caregiver too. So some of the common characteristics, like I said, shorter utterances, more stress on certain words or syllables, substantial repetition, use of paraphrases, a heavy reliance on questions. So as you know, these things we all use when talking with the children because we want them to understand what we talk about. This view also have supporting evidence. So many researchers suggest that CDS may in fact make it easier for the child to pick out the important segments in a speech. So when we stress certain words when talking, so the child will be able to pick these words that we are focusing on. And so this supports that CDS make it easier for the child to understand language. Also, studies have found that children with mothers who tend to talk more per unit of time display more rapid vocabulary growth. So, the children that are exposed to more language or communicate more with their parents tend to acquire language more rapidly. So, this also supports this view. But this view also had criticism. So making certain assumptions that remain untested. So this view makes several assumptions, but these assumptions are not tested yet. Also, CDS is not that simple and therefore might not be inherently helpful in allowing the child to acquire language. So CDS or child-directed speech is not always simple. So it's not the simplicity in it that helps the child acquire the language. So if it's not simple, how does it help the child to acquire the language? So it's a criticism. Also, it has also been pointed out that some CDS features have not been found in a number of languages. So, if it is really important and really helps the child to acquire the language, or really essential to acquire the language, it has to be universal. But studies found out that there is countries or languages that doesn't have CDS at all. So we can't say that it is essential or critical for language acquisition. Actually, it was also found that there is no relation between the complexity of the mother's speech and children's language gain. So, if the mother talks with her child in CDS or talks with her child in normal speech that we use among us adults, it shows no difference. The child gain the language or acquire the language all the same. So then we have our fourth view, which is emergentism. So from its name, or how the name suggests, so the language emerge at certain times. It appears out of nowhere. So we have a quote from a study. So language development is no longer seen as a process of acquiring abstract tools, but as the emergence of language abilities in real time. So it's no longer just acquiring abstract tools. So it's like language abilities emerge in time. So like at certain months, certain ability appears, like being able to pronounce certain sounds, being able to acquire certain words. Like in certain months, in real time, like in cada month, this ability occur. So proponents of this view suggest that language emerges out of complex networks of interconnection between neurons. So it's something biological. It's something in our brain. It has nothing to do with the environment around us in this case, actually. So it's the emergence of rules or language abilities in real time. We have a view that is inspired by emergentism, which is connectionism, that language is learned through exposure to language in the environment, the input. It's actually, from this sentence, you might think that it's similar to behaviorism, but it's not. So, the exposure allows the construction of association among units, leading to greater associative strength. Like what? Like, imagine hearing the word fast food many times. So your brain, or the connection between the neurons that have these words, which is fast and food, becomes very strong. So the words will be permanently stuck together. Sorry, just a minute. Okay. So, like when we hear fast and food, the connection between the neurons becomes stronger. So these units become permanently acquired. Fast food, or do a project, or like make a mistake. These collocations become acquired by being exposed to them in the environment, which is the input. So, but we have supporting evidence. which is they use a model in computer simulation to examine past tense acquisition on verbs. So they made a computer simulation to examine this view. The model predicted learning sequences found in typical L1 English past tense acquisition. So they made this simulation to predict the acquisition of the past tense morpheme, which is the ed in English. So it resulted in a U-shaped curve that connectionists used to support the theory. So this is the U-shaped curve. So they say that the child starts by using the correct form, which is go, went. After some time, they use the incorrect form, like go, goat, or sometimes wented, maybe. After some time, they go to using the correct form. So the computer simulation actually could predict this U-shaped curve, and they use this to support the evidence, like that language is acquired from an interconnection between neurons. But also this view had criticism, like this model is still in the early stages of testing. Actually, it is the newest of the four, so they haven't tested it enough to be very trusted. Also, it is not clear how connectionism can account for the effect of non-linguistic contextual information. So we knew how we acquire like collocation, maybe units of sounds or something like that. But non-linguistic, or what we talked about, paralinguistic information, we don't know how we acquire them through this model. So it's also criticized. This is all we can talk about the four views. Each view had supporting evidence and criticism, so not we haven't like stuck to one of them, but we have to know what scientists had to say about each of them. So that's all we're gonna talk about today. Thanks for watching and see you again in the next video.